Great. Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for coming to this presentation for One Book, One College. Couple quick announcements. If you have not heard, and let me go grab the flyer. If you have not heard, every time you come to a One Book, One College event, you are participating in an overall event titled Joy of Learning. And each time you come to an event, you get points. And as you earn points, you get added to a leaderboard. And at the end of the semester, whoever is in the lead on most attendance and most interactions with the library will win a $50 Walmart gift card. So something to look into. Come by the library, ask us for more information, what the point values are, and different ways that you can participate. There are sign-up sheets up here on the front table. And those sign-ups, you'll put your name and your instructor, and this is where you will be able to earn points through that, and also extra credit points if your professor is offering it for this talk. There's also a basket up front where you can enter your information, and we will be giving out a free copy of the Book of Joy at the end of the presentation. Before we give it out, we'll make sure that everybody has their name in, so you don't need to all clamor up there now. But today we're here to hear from Aaron James, and he is doing a talk titled Happiness, Compassion, and Morality. And Aaron is recently tenured here at ICC, and he teaches philosophy. He's taught 10 years previously in Ohio, and his PhD is from the University of Dayton. He lives in Washington with his wife and 2 daughters. So thank you so much, Aaron. It's all yours.
Thanks. All righty. Well, first of all, thank you all for being here. So I asked you if you would, in case any of you came in later, there should be some extra note cards. If you go ahead and just write a definition or description of happiness, we'll use those here in a little bit. You're not going to have to turn them into me or anything, but I would like to hear from a few of you in a bit. And if you have any questions or comments as we go along, you can always write them down on the other side as well. All right? Okay, so then I want to talk today a little bit about happiness. Perhaps like all of you, I would like to be happy. And I indeed would like to know how to be happy. And if you've read the Book of Joy, there's some advice in there about what that might look like. I'd like, though, for us to think about it with respect not just to happiness, but with respect to morality. Now, this is just one quote from the text. This is actually the Dalai Lama's words here. Too much self-centered thinking is the source of suffering. A compassionate concern for others' well-being is the source of happiness. Now, part of what makes sense of that quote for the Dalai Lama is actually some Buddhist philosophy and metaphysics. And in fact, here's a shameless advertisement. If you'd like to know more about that, you should take our Philosophy 112 comparative religions class. Buddhism is one of the religions that we study in that class. But I want to sort of set aside for now at least some of those metaphysical claims and just note what is there. Too much self-centered thinking is a source of suffering. A compassionate concern for others' well-being is the source of happiness. Well, I actually would like to make a claim, sort of, I guess, in response to that. And in fact, this is the claim that I'm going to be, to some degree, defending, but perhaps more so just explaining here today. Compassion is a necessary ingredient to being moral, and being moral is a necessary ingredient to being happy. Now, a lot of my claim, I think, is probably going to depend upon what we mean here by being happy, right? In fact, in English even, one of the reasons that I asked you to write on the cards as I did, in English we use happy even just ordinarily across a fairly wide range, although perhaps some similar cases. And so part of my job is going to try to be to clarify what that might mean. And I'm actually going to try to relate it back to what the Dalai Lama and Desmond Tutu say. But it might follow with the kind of piece of practical advice, and actually this isn't mine, this comes straight from the book. But if my claim is defensible, if it's somehow rightly related to the Dalai Lama's claim there, then it looks like a kind of practical piece of advice is to cultivate compassion, right? So if all of this hangs together, you're welcome. I've just given you the secret to happiness, right? Cultivate compassion. Well, You can see what you think about that. Okay, so here's what I want to do then. First, I want to define compassion here. What do we mean by that? And we can probably do that actually fairly quickly, I think. And then I want to say something about morality. Again, I'm a philosopher, so we've got to kind of define our terms, at least to some degree, so we can all be clear what we're talking about. I think both of those will go fairly quickly, and then spend a little bit of extra time here on this business about happiness. Because again, even just in ordinary English, we use that term fairly widely to perhaps mean different things. Okay, so first compassion, then morality, and then we'll get to happiness, and part of my job is going to try to be to show why there might be a link between all of those. All right, so what is compassion? Well, now, again, my guess is all of us probably have a fairly general idea of what that amounts to. This is the definition that Jinpa gives. If you've read the book, Jinpa is the translator for the Dalai Lama, and he himself actually is a Buddhist scholar. And actually what Jinpa says here is, again, just completely consistent with sort of Buddhist philosophy and the Buddhist religion. But here's the way he defines it. So if we're talking about compassion, what do we mean? Well, compassion is a sense of concern that arises when we're confronted with another's suffering and feel motivated to see that suffering relieved. Now, there are a couple of pieces here that I want to call your attention to. This account of compassion does embody the way in which people can be responsive to one another, right? So this business about a sense of concern that arises when we are confronted with another's suffering. Of course, there are other possible responses that we can make when confronted with another's suffering, right? We could ignore it. We could not be moved by it in any way, right? We could perhaps be callous or indifferent towards it. But in Buddhism, compassion is this sense of, we might think of it as something like empathy, a kind of ability to sort of identify perhaps to some degree, or at least sort of imagine what it would be like to be in the shoes of a person who is suffering. So there's one piece of it. We give a kind of consideration to others. But then secondly, and most importantly, it's not just empathy, it's also then, at least so far as possible, doing something about it. Trying to relieve the suffering so far as we can. So these two pieces here, kind of empathetic response to the needs and suffering of others, followed by an intention, a motivation, actually doing something about it. Now, of course, not in every case can we directly do something about it, right? The war in Syria, right? If some of you have seen this on the news, I mean, maybe this sounds judgmental, but if you're a human being, surely you have seen this, and you might have actually felt some sympathy, but if not, at least you can empathize with what that would be like. Well, I can't stop the war in Syria, right? There's nothing directly I can do about it. But the Dalai Lama at one point says, compassion here would still apply, because even though I can't directly do something about it, I can still wish or intend that something be done about it. And that, broadly speaking, looks to fall under the sphere of compassion here. Now, this, I think, is actually fairly closely related to the Christian concept of love. The Dalai Lama is, of course, Buddhist, but Desmond Tutu is an Anglican. And I've just taken here a definition from Thomas Aquinas. Some of you might know that name. He's an important figure in the history of Christian thought. And actually, this account of love is even borrowed from Aristotle, an ancient Greek. And so here's the way Thomas Aquinas defines love. He says love is to wish, or I put in brackets there, intend good to someone. Now, this isn't identical to the concept of compassion. I mean, after all, just in this definition here, there's no direct reference to something like empathy or identifying perhaps with the suffering of another. But there is a link here with respect to the wish or intention. And of course, another possible difference here is this is perhaps a broader account. I mean, I could in fact do good to someone other than only relieving their suffering. So these are not identical concepts, but there is, I think, a pretty strong family resemblance here. In both cases, there is the intention or the motivation to do good to another. Now, I think it's worth pointing out here, this all sounds great if we're talking about my friends, right? I would be quite happy to be compassionate towards them. But as a matter of fact, this actually comes up in the book. According to Buddhism, and just given the Christian conception of love here, the scope of compassion, or the scope of love, is supposed to be wider than that. In fact, this it does include enemies. The Dalai Lama tells some of his story about the Chinese occupation and some of his responses to that. And part of what he describes in more than one place is the importance of him making sure to remember that though these people are his enemies in a sense, right? They're occupying his homeland, they're still human. And he still has to respond to them as humans. Desmond Tutu in the context of South Africa and apartheid, a similar kind of thing here. And a story that I've just always found, I guess, moving or meaningful is Martin Luther King Jr. This particular quote I got from a biography about him. And he uttered this actually in 1956 during the Montgomery bus boycott, if any of you know about that. One evening, Martin Luther King Jr. was at a meeting related to this bus boycott. His wife and children were at home, and somebody firebombed his house. Now, it turns out his wife and children were okay. They weren't injured. But, of course, he rushes back to his home. By the time he gets there, there's already a large group of people there, of his supporters who are there. And, like, they're ready to get revenge, right? They're ready to go after the people that did this to him. And he says this to them. He says, I want you to love your enemies. You have to be good to them. Love them and let you know that you love them. And I think that relates here both to the concept of compassion and to the concept of love. And again, I think it's worth keeping in mind here, because compassion and love might sound easy if we're talking about friends, right? But at least for Buddhism and for Christianity, and I think to get at what the Dalai Lama is saying here, this is supposed to include the wider scope of enemies. Now, there's quite a lot to be said here, right? It doesn't mean that I need to ignore injustice or that I can just sort of excuse it. What it does mean, though, is in addressing injustices or in addressing wrong, I have to keep the good of another in view. I can't just do destructive things in order to make redress of some sort. Well, there's a lot more to be said about that, but that's enough perhaps to give you an idea of how I'm using the term compassion. Now, remember, my claim was there is a link between compassion, morality, and happiness, right? So what about morality then? Well, there's a lot to be said about this, and here's another shameless advertisement. If you'd like to know more about morality, you can take Philosophy 115, our ethics class, and also Philosophy 110, our Introduction to Philosophy class. Introduction to Philosophy, we'll talk a little bit about ethics. Of course, a class devoted to ethics will talk a lot more about it. Well, what do I mean here by morality? Well, again, my sense is all of us probably have a sort of, if not a working definition, a kind of sense of what we might mean here. But if we're thinking about morality, just one way to sort of get at it here is to think about the different force that we might give to a command, right? So you ought to do X, Y, or Z. Some kinds of oughts, you ought to do this or you ought not to do this, really amount to just kind of some practical advice, right? So you heard from Brian there, I live over in Washington. Well, at the end of the day, if I want to get home and I get over here to, which direction am I pointing? I get over here to 24, right? I ought to turn right in order to go to Washington, right? I ought not turn left. But now if I use that same word ought in a different context, I ought not torture and kill innocent babies merely for fun. Sorry for that weird example, but I'm trying to give a kind of obvious one here, right? I ought not torture and kill innocent babies for fun. Well, it looks like the force of that ought is a bit different than the kind of, we wouldn't say to that person, just here's a piece of practical advice to keep you out of trouble through life, right? We mean something like, you've got good reasons, at least as a rational being, for why you ought not to do that sort of thing. Okay? Now there's a lot more to be said about that. Again, you could take ethics. But what we mean by morality is something sort of like that. But now if we're talking about morality, we can talk about it here in a couple of different senses. Sometimes we use that term or that concept in a merely descriptive sense. So we could talk about the rules or values that people just as a matter of fact adopt. Like, for example, let's do a poll. Okay, I made a claim just a moment ago that I ought not to, torture and kill innocent babies merely for fun. How many of you would agree that that is part of your moral code? Go ahead, raise your hands. Of course, all of you would agree with that, right? I keep waiting for someone to not raise their hands, and then I just assume they're asleep instead of assuming otherwise. Well, okay, so now we've just learned something sort of descriptively true about the moral code that you and I happen to adopt, right? It looks to be empirically verifiable that you and I just happen to adopt that moral rule. But of course, I, like you, probably want to say something more about it. Not just that as a matter of fact, that is a moral rule that you and I adopt, but that we ought to adopt it. And in fact, I'll go a bit further and say everybody ought to adopt that moral rule, right? In other words, we can ask normative questions about morality, not just what, as a matter of fact, a culture or a person believes is right and wrong, but what they ought to believe is right and wrong. Now, there are a lot of interesting and difficult questions to be asked about that, surely, I grant that. But again, I'm just going to sort of work with the assumption here that even though there's some difficult questions about relativism and differences in cultures that we could ask, at the end of the day, I'd be willing to bet that there are some things that are just wrong for anyone to do. I mean, genocide is just morally wrong. If a particular culture thinks it's okay, well, I mean, okay, that's an interesting descriptive fact, but they're mistaken. At least that would be the view that I and probably a number of you would hold, right? You ought not commit genocide. Now, okay, again, a lot to be said about morality, but here's sort of a key idea. Well, why can we, or how can we make sense of the difference that my kind of practical advice, you know, you ought not turn left on 24 if you want to get to Washington, versus you ought not torture and kill innocent children merely for fun? Well, maybe one way of sort of capturing how we can make sense of the difference of the forces of those ought is this. One perhaps key feature of morality, the sorts of oughts in view here, are that we have to give consideration to others. So if I just change my mind and decide to go hang out in Peoria this afternoon, well, no biggie, right? I haven't done anything morally wrong, probably, by turning left instead of turning right. But if, of course, this is getting weirder now that I say this out loud, but if, of course, I were to torture and kill an innocent child merely for fun, I don't know, because I was bored on Saturday, well, then I've still done something morally wrong, right? I have done something that I ought not to do. And how can we make sense of that? Well, because I have to give consideration to the infant, to the pain and suffering and so forth, and to those who love the infant. Now, if that's true, it seems to me there's an interesting connection here then between compassion and love, right? Compassion is giving consideration to the suffering of another. Love, in the way I defined it a moment ago, is giving consideration to the good of another and then doing something about it. But there's one more thing I want to say here to really press where I'm going with this. So I've used all the examples here with respect to our actions, right? What one ought to do or ought not to do. And indeed, in ethics, we talk a lot about that. There are some things that people just shouldn't do, morally speaking. However, there is a difference, it seems to me at least, between doing a right action and being a good person. So, in case you're wondering, I would never torture and kill innocent children merely for fun, partly because I have certain values, right? I think I can identify with others, right? I think there are good reasons that I have for not torturing and killing innocent children merely for fun. But suppose, you know, Joe over here, right? I don't know, maybe Joe's, you know, a just thoroughly messed up person. And Joe has tried all kinds of adventures and he thinks to himself, you know, one thing I've never done? I've never tortured and killed an innocent child merely for fun. This kind of sounds interesting, right? But then suppose Joe thinks to himself, maybe I shouldn't do that though, because I really don't want to go to jail, right? And so Joe refrains from torturing and killing the innocent child merely for fun. Well, Joe has done something morally right, and in fact, I'm quite glad that Joe refrained from doing that. But it seems to me like there's something importantly different about me, a kind of evaluation that you might want to make about my character, and Joe, right? I mean, for all of that, Joe is still a thoroughly wicked person, and I want him nowhere near my children, right? Well, okay, so it does seem as though there is a difference here between just doing a morally right action and being a certain kind of person. And in fact, it's really this person sense of morality that I want to connect here with happiness. So here's sort of where we are so far. What I'm really trying to claim here is this. A stable disposition here, that is the character trait, the kind of habit of being motivated by, of having certain empathetic kinds of responses. The stable disposition to intend and do good to others is a necessary ingredient in being a moral person. It may not be a necessary ingredient in being a right moral, in doing a right moral action, but it does seem to me that it is a, and again perhaps not the only, but a necessary ingredient in being a moral person. The kind of person that we would evaluate positively from the moral point of view. Now the next step is to connect this with happiness, and here's where I'm curious what you said, right? So again, the concepts of compassion and morality, not that there's not a lot to think about, but those I think are relatively straightforward. But how about happiness? So could I hear from a few of you? What did you say on your card here? How did you define happiness, or what kinds of descriptions did you give of it? Yeah, Nick?
I put a lack of suffering.
A lack of suffering? There you go. All right, good. Somebody else? There's no right or wrong answer here, people, right? You're not like getting points on a quiz, so you can't. Oh, there the hand goes up. What's your name? Sorry.
Freedom, Rachel.
Oh, Rachel. Go ahead.
Freedom to do what you want to.
Okay. Freedom to do what you want. Your hand went up, Susan.
Being loved and loving someone. Hopefully that's a group.
Yeah.
Not like a same people.
Good, good. Others of you? A few others of you? What'd you say? Yeah, Eric.
The Bobby McFarlane song came to mind, Be Happy, Don't Worry.
Oh, there you go. All right, yeah. Kind of an absence of worry or stress. Good. Eric teaches philosophy, so I was a little bit worried about what was going to come out of his mouth when he raised his hand. Anybody else? I'll be happy if one more person goes.
Someone who is joyful.
Oh, there you go. Excellent. Thank you. Someone who is joyful. You have relieved our misery, right? You've made us happy. Good. Now, okay, so there's a lot to be said here. A couple of quick things, though. First of all, some philosophers make a distinction here between this, and maybe this is a good one, between the sources of happiness and what happiness actually is. So like Susan, this just caught me, and again, admittedly, this was a short phrase. Whatever you meant by it is fine. But the fact that, family makes me happy, or relationships make me happy. Well, now, we could be saying a couple of things here, right? We could be saying that families or relationships are somehow constitutive. That is, they are actually part of happiness. We could be saying that they are a source of happiness, right? That in some way or other they deliver happiness to us. Now, if we mean it in that first sense, though, we still might want to know, but what is the thing that is delivered to us, right? Sort of like if I walked in, today with a box, and I know Boo here, so suppose that I just set a gift-wrapped box in front of Boo. Well, I am the source of the gift, but we still don't know what the thing is, right? We've got to unwrap it and see what's there, so to speak. Now, it sounded to me like a lot of what a couple of you at least said. You mentioned, perhaps you said lack of suffering, right? And I think Eric said something about lack of worry, right? Rachel, right? You said, what did you say? The freedom to, one more time.
Be who you want to be.
There you go. Freedom to be who you want to be, do who you want to do. Now, if you notice, those might be two different things, right? Because a lack of suffering might say something about sort of experiences of pleasure and pain. But doing or being who you want to be might say something more about what your sort of desires are, or what it is that your goals are for life, right? And in fact, I'm glad that all of you said that, because we need to clarify, I think, some different senses of happiness. Now, I'll just let you know here, most of this is not, of what's going to come up next, is not original with me. And in fact, I did this intentionally because I want to advertise to you, if any of you are interested in certain philosophical topics, this is a great free online resource. It's peer-reviewed by real philosophers. It's not, just kind of, random people up at midnight posting blogs or anything. Sometimes they're a bit technical, but they, and you can find stuff about all sorts of interesting stuff there, right? And in fact, all I did was look up, first I typed in happiness, and I got a big, gigantically long entry about that. And then it directed me also to an entry on well-being. And there's a reason for that we'll see in just a moment. So most of what's coming up next is not necessarily original with me. Well, interestingly enough, I think it's interesting, there's a kind of interesting parallel here between the way we use happiness and the way we use morality in this sense. We can talk about happiness descriptively, just as a matter of fact, or we can talk about it evaluatively. So, if you look up the description on the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy on happiness, you would encounter both senses of the term. Happiness as a descriptive psychological term. Just which psychological states are the ones, you might think of it this way, which psychological states are the ones that we ordinary English speakers, slap the label happiness onto, right? But there is a kind of evaluative sense here, and this is where that term well-being comes up. We could be asking, well, not just which psychological states do we slap the label happiness on, but what's actually good for a person? What really makes for a flourishing life, or a life characterized by well-being? And there we're making what appear to be some evaluative kinds of judgments. Now, I'm actually going to end up landing on one particular way of thinking of the value term, but I think it's worth at least just noting some of the ways that descriptively we might label happiness, because actually a couple of them came up here today, right? And by the way, I'm not a psychologist, so if you want to know more about this, go ask the psychologist. Happiness is a descriptive psychological term, though, right? Don't ask the psychologist. Why are you all laughing? I don't know about that. So there are hedonist theories, right? Hedonism just comes from the Greek word for pleasure. Here's the basic idea. Well, if we label a person as a happy one, what we're saying about them is something like this. You know, they have, on balance, more experiences of pleasure than pain. When you kind of add it all up, right, there are more experiences of pleasure than pain. And as I understand it, there are some psychologists, there's a lot of research now about like psychologically what makes people happy and, you know, sort of the happiness research. And if you ever go look at some of that, the first question you should ask is, well, what does this researcher mean by happiness, right? Like, what is it that they are attempting to describe here? And some of them seem to be describing really what amounts to just pleasures and pains, right? And maybe the couple of you who mentioned suffering and perhaps worry, maybe that might be a kind of example of that. But there's another way of going at this. Maybe what we sort of mean when we talk about a happy person is not pleasures and pains directly, but sort of like their overall attitude or evaluation of their life. So in other words, a happy person, we might say, is one who has a kind of overall satisfactory assessment of their life, perhaps. Maybe the mention there of the freedom to do what you want perhaps could fit roughly under that rubric there. There's a third one here, sometimes maybe emotional states, like we might talk about in terms of moods perhaps, right? And maybe this is even the more common one perhaps, I don't know what we might mean in English. So a person who's happy sort of tends to have moods that are overall positive as compared to the person who is sad. And then, you know, there are various combinations of these, right? Again, if you want to know more about that, there's a lot of kind of psychological research. The key thing to capture here, though, is all of these are really just descriptive terms. We haven't said anything yet about whether these are actually good for a person, right? They're just sort of there in sort of our psychological atmosphere, so to speak. Well, all right, how about happiness as a value term? Because this is really where I want us to go here. Now, it does seem to me that, although I think in English, we probably ordinarily do talk about happiness in terms of psychological states. I mean, that's partly an empirical question, and I'd be happy to be corrected about that, but just my anecdotal, ways of hearing people talk about happiness, that seems to be the case. It is still true, though, that sometimes we use happiness in a kind of evaluative sense. So my grandmother died just a few weeks ago, and we went back to Oklahoma for the funeral. And it just struck me how I heard more than one person say something like this, Mary Lou, she had a happy life. Now, of course, these people aren't philosophers, so they could have meant all kinds of stuff by this. But when they would then go on to describe what it meant for her to live a happy life, I did notice that they actually didn't often directly refer to her psychological states or experiences. They referred to things like she had a family, and she had friends, and she lived in a community, for example. Which, again, they're not philosophers, right? These are some, wonderfully, nice elderly ladies who will make you cookies if you show up at their house. My grandmother was actually, this has nothing to do with anything, but my grandmother was like the prototypical movie grandmother. This is not a joke. Every time I showed up at her house, one of her first questions was whether I wanted cookies or not. That is honest truth. Anyway, okay, so again, these folks aren't philosophers, but when they referred to the happy life that my grandmother had, it didn't seem as though they were actually directly talking about her sort of emotional states. They were making evaluations about the kind of life that she had. Well, okay, now perhaps a bit confusingly, you just saw this, this label, right? Well, indeed, though, the same term can get used here. So descriptively, we might just in English mean happiness in the sense of certain psychological states, but then some people go on to make a further claim. And those psychological states of experience, they're good for a person. They contribute to well-being. Now, though, we're making an evaluative claim. Not just that those psychological states are there and they kind of match up with the way that we English speakers use the word happiness, but now we're evaluating it and saying, and that's good for the person. That contributes to their overall flourishing or well-being, perhaps. Now, in philosophy, this also, by the way, relates to some moral judgments sometimes that people make. But hedonist theories, if you kind of take the strict versions, will essentially say this. What constitutes a happy life, what constitutes well-being, just is psychological states of more pleasure than pain. Now, there are some objections to that, and in one sense, these objections aren't terribly important, but I want to go ahead and make them because I'm actually going to try to advocate for kind of a third version down here, okay? It seems to me there might be something wanting here, and here's one of the common examples. This is not my example by any means. It's been around a long time. Robert Nozick's The Experience Machine. So here's what we're trying to see. Should we think that what constitutes a person's well-being just is more experiences of pleasure than pain? This is the question. Right, so the Experience Machine is essentially like a virtual reality simulator, right? Think like the Matrix, if any of you have seen this, right, the Matrix. And here's the basic idea. This machine has a number of wonderful features. Once we hook you up to the machine, first of all, it's so good you can't tell the difference between it and so-called real life, okay? Like you will not know after we've hooked you up. You won't know that you're in a simulation anymore. You will just think this is the real world, okay? First key criteria. Secondly, you get to choose what experiences you want to have in this machine. It's entirely up to you. If you want to, if it's been one of your life goals to climb Mount Everest, well, you just tell the machine, I want to go climb Mount Everest. You plug it in, and remember, once you're in it, you no longer know you're in the machine, right? And by golly, you can go climb Mount Everest. And because it's a machine, before you get in it, you can even say, by the way, just give me enough danger to make it thrilling, right? Don't actually hurt me, okay? So you can actually program it to give you lots of pleasures and no pains. Now, if I stop right there, that might sound like a good time to you, right? Who wouldn't want to do that for a weekend? But in order to press this question, is it really just experiences that constitute a person's good? We got to make one more stipulation here. Once you're in, you can never come back out. Now, you can program it however you want, right? You can have 80 virtual years of sheer pleasure if you would like. It's entirely up to you. But once you're in, you can't come back out. And in order to sort of deal with other worries, let's just suppose it's not quite like the Matrix. We actually can guarantee that your body out in the real world is perfectly safe. Nothing's going to happen to it. The machine's not going to break down, okay? You can be 100% guaranteed of 80 years of sheer pleasure. Now here's the question. Would you hook yourself up to the machine? Some people say yes, actually. Sometimes people do say yes. Sometimes this is described as one of those kind of wedge issues in philosophy. You sort of just land on one side or the other. Most people probably are inclined, though, to say, no, I don't think so. I think I'd still rather live in the real world. Well, why? How could we make sense of that? Well, here's the reason I wouldn't actually plug myself into such a machine. I'm married. I have 2 daughters. My wife and I have been married for 16 years, and we still like each other, right? That's fantastic. I love my kids. Now, they do indeed give me a great deal of pleasure and occasionally some pain also, right? But here's the thing. I actually don't want the pleasure in itself. I want them, right? I could program the machine to give me the exact virtual replicas of my wife and my daughters. And remember, I wouldn't know the difference once I'm in the machine, right? But I don't want the experience. I want them. Now, this is supposed to challenge then the claim that, in fact, it's not just experiences on their own that constitute well-being. Something else is required. Rachel, is that your name?
Yeah. How do you necessarily know that anything is causing you pleasure if you've never experienced any sort of negative effects? If everything's always all happy all the time, how do you really know everything's all happy?
That's possible, right? Again, this is a psychology term, but don't psychologists talk about the hedonic treadmill? It's like you experience certain kinds of pleasures and you get used to it and you have to experience some more. I mean, that's entirely possible. Maybe if it were only pleasures, it would turn out to actually not be pleasurable. Whatever, we can just sort of program into the machine, though, the best balance of pleasure, like just the minimal amount of pain so that I make sure and know what pleasure is. Yeah, but good question here, right? Maybe we can't know what an experience of pleasure is like without contrasting it with pain. That's possible. So the experience machine is meant to give us a reason for thinking maybe hedonism isn't true. There's a second kind of version here, though. Sometimes they're called desire satisfaction theories. And again, though this is not the descriptive claim, there is a kind of close parallel here. My example of my wife and daughters is meant to show this. On this view, well, in fact, what constitutes a person's well-being or flourishing are not experiences in and of themselves, but the person essentially getting what they actually want. I mean, think about it this way, right? If you really want to climb Mount Everest, well, you could simulatedly, climb Mount Everest, but really one of your desires remains unfulfilled, doesn't it? You haven't actually climbed Mount Everest. And so on these views, what really constitutes a person's well-being might include something like pleasures and pains, but more broadly, it's going to be what a person really wants, what they desire, what their sort of preferences are. As long as their desires or preferences are satisfied, they live a life of flourishing, a life of well-being. But there's an objection to this view too, and I can illustrate it here with a Google screenshot of an image search that I did. These are yard trolls, and here's the objection to a view like this. Suppose a person, I kind of thought this one looked a little bit like Donald Trump, but I probably shouldn't say that at this point. This one just creeps me out, actually. I don't really know what to say about that one. But anyway, here's the objection, right? So suppose a person who is well informed, right? Their rational capacities are working, right? Suppose that for whatever reason, they decide to organize their life around acquiring the largest and the best yard troll collection in existence. Now, note it's not just a hobby. All of us have kind of weird hobbies, right? Like, this is the meaning of their life. This is their key purpose, their central desire. They order everything else according to this. Perhaps they really don't have much of a desire for intimate relationships because they like the trolls better. Perhaps they don't have much of a desire really for a meaningful career. They just need enough money to buy them trolls, right? Now, again, I don't know about you. Maybe this is partly intuition here. But I'm inclined to think that even a person who achieves that, I can acknowledge that they might have some positive psychological states associated with their getting what they want. But I'm inclined to think for all of that, yeah, I'm not really sure that that's actually a genuinely good human life. I mean, it might be better than Hitler, right? It's not a wicked life, perhaps. But I'm inclined to think maybe there's something missing here, right? Well, what is it that could possibly be missing? Well, on a third kind of family of groups here, and this is just what the Stanford Encyclopedia labels them, and this is a label that I've heard before. There are certain objectivist theories. Now, notice something here. Both the hedonist theories and the desire theories, although these are theories of well-being, are often labeled as subjectivist theories because they are theories that explain well-being in terms of psychological states, right? Certain psychological states are what are ultimately good for a person. What all the objectivists, I'm not going to list a whole bunch of them here, don't worry. What all the objectivist views have in common, though, is rejecting that. Well, subjective psychological states might be relevant to a person's genuine good, but there are actual things outside of psychological states that really do contribute to a flourishing life. One of the classic in the history of philosophy examples of this is probably Aristotle and his view of eudaimonia. And Aristotle thought that, for one thing, there were certain character traits that had to be acquired in order to live a genuinely good human life. He went on to talk about things like friendship, for example. Not just that friendships are a source of pleasure, that might be true, but that friendships are an actual good that contributes to or is partly constitutive of a well-lived human life, of a flourishing human life. Now, there's a lot to be said about these views. As you can imagine, there are plenty of objections to them. But one common way of understanding them is to say something like, well, these goods are somehow related to human nature, just the sort of things that humans are. There appear to be certain things that sort of make for a complete or a full human life. Sometimes these are called perfectionist theories, but I think that's a bit misleading because it's not that you have to live life without a mistake. That's not the point. It's perfectionist in the sense of the complete or the whole scope of goods that make for a genuinely good human life. Okay, done with the description of all this junk part. Now here's the key question, all right? You remember my main claim here? Okay, so compassion is a necessary ingredient of morality. Morality is a necessary ingredient of happiness, right? Well, maybe we can get to it by asking this question. To which sense of happiness or of joy are Desmond Tutu and the Dalai Lama referring? Are they talking about happiness or joy in the psychological sense only? Or are they using it as a kind of evaluative term? And if they're using it as a kind of evaluative term, do they mean it only in the subjective senses, or do they mean it in an objectivist sense? Well, I want to make the claim here that I think, in fact, they probably mean it in both senses. That to label a person happiness, just as they use it in the book, or joyful, I think they mean it both in the descriptive sense. Indeed, there probably are some psychological states that are relevant here, but also in the evaluative sense, and in fact, I think more specifically even, one version of those objectivist theories. Now, I'm not going to read a lot to you because I know I've already been yakking along way too long here, but I do just simply want to call your attention to a couple of quick passages to illustrate this, okay? So on page 59, the narrator, I forgot his name, we got Douglas Abrams, he asked the Archbishop, he says, the joy you're talking about, it's not just a feeling. And he goes on to give some examples of this. And here's Desmond Tutu's response. He says, I lost my place. Here it is. He says, I mean simply that ultimately our greatest joy is when we seek to do good for others. Now, of course, there he might just simply mean that doing good for others is a source of joy. That's certainly possible, right? But then he goes on to make this claim. We are wired to be caring for the other and generous to one another. We shrivel when we're not able to interact. We're wired to do this. Seems to me like he's appealing to something about human nature, the sort of thing that we are, and that doing good to another, being motivated by doing good to another, indeed might, I mean, this is the psychological claim, might give rise to certain psychological states, but it actually fulfills part of our nature, I think he's saying. And then a little later over on page 61, the Dalai Lama adds, where is it here? He says, 61, as you mentioned, the Dalai Lama added, getting quite animated, but I'm not going to get animated. People think about money or fame or power. From the point of view of one's own personal happiness, these are short-sighted. The reality, as the Archbishop mentioned, is that human beings are social animals. There's an appeal here to the sort of thing that we are, strongly suggesting, of course, that what it means to be a social animal is to interact with one another in certain kinds of ways. And then they go on to talk a bit more about the virtuous circle and so forth. Well, so my claim is, when they're talking about happiness, they mean it in perhaps the descriptive sense, but perhaps also more importantly in the evaluative sense. Okay, so I'm going to start wrapping all this up now, finally. So here's my main claim sort of spelled out, right? The stable disposition to intend and do good to another, that's compassion/love, is a necessary ingredient in being a moral person, and being a moral person is a necessary ingredient in, descriptively, in the sense of happiness, as well as the evaluative sense of happiness. Now this descriptive sense, again, this is largely a question of psychology, but this, I think, is a question at least surely related to philosophy here. So it does seem to me that they are claiming that being a moral person is perhaps actually one of the things on that list of objective goods that make for a genuinely flourishing human life. Well then, how are you going to be happy? Well, the first question to ask is in what sense, right? What is going to give you certain psychological states? And then also, though, what is actually going to contribute to your well-being? Well, at least this is what I think the Dalai Lama and Desmond Tutu are saying. Cultivating the stable disposition to intend and do good to others is both constitutive of a really, genuinely good human life, and if at least they're right, also contributes to the sort of positive psychological states that we would label as happiness. All right, now if you got questions or comments, I don't know what time this is actually officially supposed to end.
1:30.
1:30? Oh, okay, good. So we got 15 minutes or so. If any of you need to leave, that's fine. Go right ahead. I'm happy any questions or comments or discussion you have. If you were just staring at me blankly, well, there are some things that you could consider in order to try to reflect on some of these concepts. Yeah, Nick?
So right now I'm reading a book, Enlightenment Now, and in the book they're arguing that people's lives are improving, especially in like the third world. And the author makes the argument that people tend to look at people moving from farm work in the third world to factory work in the third world as like really like sad. That people are moving into sweatshops rather than working in the fields. But these people are choosing a sweatshop over a field. And do you think it's fair to say that from an evaluative sense, they're actually less happy because they have this like less aesthetically like pleasing lifestyle, like this like really mundane factory work that's kind of like disgusting to think about. Like we imagine like this beautiful farmland agrarian lifestyle is like way better. Is it fair to say that they can actually be wrong about being happier?
Well, let's say it this way, and you already started to say this earlier. The first question we got to ask is, can they be wrong about being happier? Well, which sense of happiness do we mean here, right? Descriptively or evaluatively? It's kind of an interesting question, and philosophers spend some time thinking about this, right? Can you sort of like, can you be, how would you say this? Can you be wrong about your emotional experiences, so to speak? Like, I think I'm having an experience of pleasure, but I'm actually experiencing pain. Well, I don't know, that seems kind of like a strange thing to say, right? However, it's possible that we maybe, this is again a psychological question, I guess. Could we misinterpret our moods? Like, I think I'm doing okay, I'm feeling okay, but actually, in fact, there's maybe some undercurrents of sadness there. So there is the descriptive question, but you did earlier, you principally asked it in terms of the evaluative sense, right? Well, I don't really know exactly what to say about that. I mean, I suspect there are lots of things on which it depends. However, I suppose it would boil down to this, right? Well, what are the things that actually constitute the fulfillment, as it were, of the sort of being that a human is? And indeed, I mean, again, I'm just sort of thinking off the top of my head here. You could imagine ways in which the factory work, especially the kind of sweatshop environments where you've got incredibly long hours, indeed probably does work against human flourishing, right? It doesn't, in fact, allow a human to sort of satisfy some needs, like for autonomy, for example. Not just physical goods, but even things like autonomy. Perhaps it doesn't allow you to develop the kinds of social relationships. And then it would just be a question, I guess, of comparing that to, again, the actual farm conditions under which, in which people find themselves, right? And I don't know the answer to that. That seems to me to be dependent upon just what the conditions are in those circumstances, maybe. I don't know.
I get the sense that, like, working in a sweatshop, it sounds disgusting to me in a similar sense to, like, someone collecting those gross trolls.
Yeah.
Like, that's not good.
No, the trolls are worse. Trolls are worse.
It's kind of like a hoarding thing, really, when people hoard stuff.
Yeah.
I mean, okay, in principle, I'm fine with the trolls, just, as long as you're not my neighbor, because that's... I don't know, other questions or comments about that?
Hasn't it been kind of like, off what he was going on about, hasn't it been kind of like, not in all cases, but like sometimes it's kind of proven that people do misconstrue their happiness for other things, like, I don't know, it's not necessarily like happiness, I suppose, but like when you have, say, like a victim of domestic abuse or something, she or he, even they might not necessarily think that what they're going through is as awful as when you say it out loud and you express what happened or something. It's like,
Yeah, so...
or like somebody who has like, what's it called when you like feel for your abductor or something?
Yeah, what is
Stockholm
that?
syndrome.
Yeah, Stockholm syndrome.
Like something like that.
So I think, again, the psychologists would know a lot more about this than I do, but I do think in psychology it does appear to be the case that humans are able to sort of adjust, at least to some degree, their kinds of moods and expectations to their circumstances, to some degree, right? So the person who's in an abusive relationship, I mean, there may be a lot of things about it that they don't like, but they can sort of adjust themselves to be able to at least continue to function, right? And that would be partly the descriptive sense. But of course, it does seem as though that would be a good example, though, of something that works against a person's actual well-being or flourishing. And then, of course, the question is, well, is the person sort of misinterpreting, or are they just not in a position to be able to make the decision to, do something different? I mean, it does seem to be the case that whether or not you think you can be, experiencing pain but actually be experiencing pleasure and not know it, it surely is the case that we often misidentify the sorts of things that might give us a certain psychological state, right? I think this is going to give me lots of pleasure. Oops, that hurt. Or, I think this is going to really satisfy a desire that I have and I'm going to find it satisfactory. Oh, shoot, that was crap, right? That didn't work. So, I mean, in that sense, we certainly can be mistaken. Yeah. I don't know. Other questions or comments? Nick?
If you found out you have been in an experience machine your whole life, would you take it off?
Yeah, that's an interesting question.
Because I would not.
Well, The Matrix is actually kind of an interesting philosophical movie here, right? What's Keanu Reeves, character? Does Keanu Reeves have characters? I don't know. But Neo, right? Neo? Yeah, Neo. I heard Brian say that. Neo. Neo does, right? I mean, they figure out that they're in the Matrix, and he chooses to get out of it. There is one character in one of the movies who doesn't, right? Who decides to just stay in. Yeah. Well, that's an interesting question. I mean, given the shape of my life That's an interesting question. Given the shape of my life now, if it turned out that my wife and children were fictional simulations, and really I just lived like the people in the Matrix, that's an interesting question. If I suddenly realized that they're not real, would I choose to stay in the Matrix? Yeah, sorry, go ahead. What's your name?
Good, Emma. But the other thing with the Matrix, though, was that they actually found out that they were being used as like human batteries.
Yeah.
So with your simulation was that we weren't being harmed, we weren't being like messed with. So then I guess it's like if we still had that being the thing, it wasn't like the Matrix in that sense.
Yeah, that is a good and interesting distinction here, right? I mean, part of the objection, I don't remember the movies very well, so I'm glad you said that, but part of their repulsion at being in the Matrix perhaps isn't merely that it's fictional, it's that they're being used. And indeed, there are probably some good reasons to object to that, right? Yeah, good point. What if though what if I realize that I'm in the experience machine and I signed up for it a number of years ago, right? Then would I want to exit or stay in? You know, my wife and children were simulations. Yeah, that's a good question. Any other questions or comments? Yeah.
I was wondering if you could answer from a philosophy standpoint. Do you think that a moral, wicked, cruel person can be happy?
Yeah, excellent question. Well, it seems to me the first question we've got to ask is, well, in which sense of happy, right? Can a cruel, wicked, or immoral person have positive psychological states? I guess maybe. I mean, that's possible. Presumably they can experience certain kinds of pleasures. For all I know, they can even, view their life as overall satisfactory. Can they be happy in the evaluative sense? Well, I mean, given what I've said, I'm inclined to say no, right? Because a cruel, wicked person is not, in fact, is not sort of perfecting, not in the sense of making errors, but in the sense of actually fulfilling or completing like what it means to be human. So it looks to me, and in fact, I'm glad that you asked that because I meant this question intentionally, right? Anytime someone wants to know about happiness, the first question you ought to ask is, well, what are you talking about? Are you talking about certain positive psychological states? Are you making an evaluation here? Because the answer could be both, perhaps. I mean, in the sense that maybe they could be happy in the descriptive sense, but if you take the objectivist views, they couldn't be happy in the evaluative sense.
Even if they didn't think that they were doing anything wrong?
Yeah, they're just mistaken. They are doing stuff wrong, right? If the objectivist views hold, right? Yeah. Anything else? Well, some of you may know, I don't know if you go rather, I don't know, how does the schedule work on Tuesdays, Thursdays? I don't know if there are classes that start at 1:30, but if some of you need to go, I dismiss you.